In my best radio announcer voice, you're listening to what are you listening to? This is Let me try that again. You're listening to Uncovering Dark Falls, the only podcast guaranteed to give you goosebumps. Hey, I couldn't believe it. This particular investigation had taken months, but I had just discovered the remains of a creature that isn't known to man. This thing roamed the streets and the homes of Dark Falls in the year 1961. The details of this creature's origin were pretty much non-existent because nobody knew what it was. Well, except for a 76-year-old woman who was now living in Dark Falls assisted living retirement home. I'd come across this woman's name several times during my research, and I knew without a doubt that she was the only one who knew firsthand what this creature was, because she lived with it during her childhood. It took a lot of digging, but luckily for me, I'd found out she was still alive, and I managed to track her down to the Dark Falls senior home. The drive, thankfully, wasn't a long one. And as I got out of the car, that familiar scent of old furniture, disinfectant, and medicated ointments that I usually associated with senior homes filled my nostrils. It reminded me of my grandma, whom I hadn't spoken to in a while, and I decided to call her after I'd wrapped up this investigation. Anyway, I made my way to the front desk and I confirmed her room number before opening the door to see the 76-year-old Katrina, or Kat as she goes by, Merton, sitting in her wooden rocking chair. I'd reached out to her earlier that week through some emails, and she'd agreed to talk with me today. I started the interview by asking her how she was and if she enjoyed staying in the retirement home. I'd also brought her some pastries from a nearby bakery, and when the pleasantries were over, I decided to finally get back to my investigation, which was the reason for my visit. I had a lot of questions that I wanted to ask Kat, and I didn't know where to start, honestly. It wasn't often that I get to talk to an actual person of interest in my investigations because, as you know, most of them in my previous Dark Falls cases were either dead or missing or just left town entirely, like any sane person would do. To be honest, I don't blame them. As Katrina took another bite out of the cinnamon roll that I'd gotten for her, I started to wonder about all of the bizarre things that this woman had seen over the course of her life in this strange town of Dark Falls. However, what I really had the most interest in that moment was her pet, the one that she had when she was 12, and the reason for this whole investigation. After she finished what was left of her pastries, Kat told me everything from the very beginning, and her story started by her saying, "I can never forget what that devilish creature looked like and how it nearly altered the course of our lives forever. It all started a little while after our parents had taken us to our new home. It was such a grand house, and you can't imagine how beautiful and large it was. The lawn out front was massive, with not one, but 2 balconies overlooking it. The house also had several rooms and enough space that I could finally use to get away from my little brother's oily face, which was a luxury that I didn't have in our older, much smaller house." She goes on to say, "My oiled-faced little brother, Daniel, was also ecstatic, and we couldn't wait to settle in and create some beautiful memories in our new home. But, unfortunately for us, our happiness was short-lived because, while I didn't realize it at the time, we wouldn't get to create any of those beautiful memories due to the creature that had been living in our home long before us. Our misfortune all began when I noticed our dog, Killer, had taken a strange interest in something beneath the sink. Killer was incessantly sniffing through the cabinet that was located right under the kitchen sink, and it wasn't long before he dug something that I'd initially assumed was a sponge. I studied the sponge-like creature that Killer had found, and I soon realized that it was moving. A few minutes after that, my weasel little brother, Daniel, saw the creature and wanted to get a closer look at it, so he started a fight over who gets to keep it. I was always bickering with my younger brother, and I often assumed that Daniel picked fights with me because he was subconsciously salty that I came into this world before he did. Now don't get me wrong, we loved each other, and I knew our little spats were how we showed that sibling love, but something was off about this particular fight, because it seemed someone, or I guess something that I couldn't see, had made Daniel really mad and pushed him to pick a fight with me because he'd flown off the handle way too easily. Our argument got so tense that our mother had to step in and stop the fight before it got any more serious. And after we'd been separated, I continued studying the odd creature even more closely, and I could now tell that it had eyes. I was excited, so I went to show my father, who was out fixing some things on his ladder. However, when he turned around to see the sponge-like creature that I'd found, something dreadful happened. 1 second, my father was on the ladder, and the next, he was tumbling down like he'd been pushed by a sudden gust of wind. The sight was unsettling, because it was an extremely sunny day with no harsh winds, and I started to get this feeling of dread in my stomach because I believed something that I couldn't see had purposely pushed him down. Kat goes on to say, my father shared the same sentiments, as he knew someone had shoved him, but I was the only person there, so all the accusations, well, they fell towards me, and I couldn't do anything to defend myself. As that dreadful day came to an end, I sat deep in thought, and I realized that something was eerily off with our new home. Aside from my little spats with my brother, the Mertens were usually a peaceful family, rarely ever getting into heated arguments with one another, but for some reason, we suddenly had several problems and fights on our first day after moving in. Now, I wasn't that much of a superstitious person, but I knew that the day was going great until my new unexpected pet came into our lives. Before Killer found the sentient sponge under the sink, we were all happy, and everything had gone downhill after that, which I didn't think was a coincidence. I also realized that I knew nothing about this sponge-like creature or where it had come from, so to give myself at least a little peace of mind, I went outside and I threw it in the trash, hoping that our bad luck would end. But unfortunately, my greedy little brother was drawn to it like Gollum to a ring, so he fished it out of the trash and he brought it right back into our lives. It was at this point in Katrina's story that I asked if she wanted a glass of water or to take a break from the long reminiscing. And she agreed, actually, so I got up to pour her a cup, and as I handed her the glass, I had a wide grin on my face because I was so happy that I got to hear the first-hand experience of the first recorded events that happened with this creature all of those years ago. As I said earlier, I rarely got to talk face-to-face with these people, and usually I just had to fill in my own blanks with some second-hand details due to the fact that I was piecing the story together myself. However, this time was completely different, because I didn't have to second guess or fill in any of the blanks. I had a front row seat to everything that happened with Katrina's strange pet. I initially wanted to bring the preserved remains of the creature to the interview for confirmation, but I later decided against it because I didn't want to fight Katrina. So I left the preserved remains outside in the back seat of my car. However, even though I didn't bring the remains inside for her confirmation, her detailed description of the sponge-like creature made sense. The skeletal remains of the creature that I uncovered were incredibly unique. There was no doubt in my mind that it was the same one that terrorized the Merton family all of those years ago. But there were still some unanswered questions because Kat hadn't really explained what this creature was and how it was causing these problems in their lives. She'd finished her glass of water by now, and she continued her recollection with this. Even though I thought I'd thrown it out, the sponge creature lingered in my mind like a bad tune, so I decided to look into it. I'd gotten a large encyclopedia, and I flipped through all the pages that it had on sponges, just praying that one of the pages held the truth behind the creature that our dog, Killer, had found. While the encyclopedia didn't have exactly what I was looking for, it did reveal a lot about sponge-like creatures. A part of me had started to think the creature was a sea sponge due to the way it looked, but the book disproved this by explaining how sea sponges couldn't survive outside the sea for an extended period. Now, after failing to find anything concrete on the creature in the encyclopedia's pages, I decided to take the eerie sponge that Daniel had retrieved from the trash, and we began to ask our friends if they'd ever seen it before. The very first person that we showed the sponge to was a close friend, Carlo. Carlo was extremely intrigued by the unknown creature. Carlo wanted to study it extensively, but before he could even examine the sponge, he unfortunately punctured his foot on a nail. The accident came out of nowhere, and Carlo couldn't carry out his planned research on the sponge due to this injury. So, the following day, I placed the creature in a container and I took it with me to school. I planned on showing it to one of my teachers, hoping that they'd know something that could help explain where this thing might have come from. However, while I didn't know it at the time, the creature had other plans, because it nearly killed me before I even got to school. I know it's going to sound crazy, but as I walked outside, a sturdy branch from the tree outside of our home suddenly just gives way, and it starts hurtling toward my head. Luckily, my little brother Daniel shoved me in the opposite direction of the branch's trajectory, saving my life in the process. Even though the sponge-like creature couldn't speak, it seemed like it was doing everything within its unseen power to stop us from finding out what it was. But I wasn't going to let that deter me. So, I brushed off the near-death experience and I took it to school, where I showed my teacher. The creature turned out to be much smarter than I assumed, as it laid motionless when I attempted to prove that it was alive. I was frightened now as the sponge started to show signs of extreme intelligence and even deceit by playing dead. It also drew blood again as my teacher's hand was badly wounded in an accident involving her desk, which is something that happened right after she'd come in contact with the creature. It really seemed like all hope was lost, and I thought that I was never going to find out where the creature came from, or if my superstitions about it causing the bad things to happen were true. But, surprisingly, an answer to all of my questions came from my oily-faced little brother.
I couldn't wait to hear what Daniel had done to help the situation, so I urged Kat to continue, and she says,
Daniel had found an old book titled Encyclopedia of the Weird, and he claimed the creature's origin was detailed within its pages. The evil sponge was apparently called a gruel, and it was a mythical animal that thrived by causing bad luck all around it. The encyclopedia also had a disturbing revelation as well. It said that when someone uncovers a gruel, the person becomes the owner and can't give it away. Now, what was even worse was that it warned that any attempt to get rid of it would cause the owner to die in less than 24 hours. There were several other details on the gruel's history and how it's closely related to another mythical creature called the lynx, which is a much more menacing animal that looked like a potato with fangs. Even though the book had confirmed most of my theories and my superstitions, I initially brushed it all off as just fantastical rubbish, and I assumed there would be a scientific or biological explanation for the gruel. So I returned the Encyclopedia of the Weird back to my brother,
telling him that it was pure gibberish. However, in the days that followed, I came to realize that there are some things that science can't explain, because I saw firsthand that fantasy and reality can somehow exist in tandem for the people living in the bizarre town of Dark Falls.
The sun was starting to go down when Katrina finished the second part of her story, and I knew that it'd soon be time for me to leave the retirement home. I didn't want to keep Kat awake all through the night at her old age, so I suggested that I just come back tomorrow morning for her to finish the interview. But to my surprise, she actually insisted that I stayed, telling me how she never got visitors anymore who that she could talk to and share her story with. I could tell that Katrina had repeatedly rehearsed telling this story over and over again in her mind, just waiting for the day that someone would come along and listen and believe her. I also noticed that recalling all of the traumatic memories of the gruel was taking a toll on Katrina, because she'd been taking several pauses whenever her voice broke, and her hands were sometimes trembling as well. So I insisted again on finishing the interview in the morning. I even told her how my own grandma was always telling me how important her beauty sleep was at her age, so even if I would have loved to finish hearing her story this night, I knew that she needed to rest. Despite my incessant advice urging Katrina to sleep, she was determined to finish her story, as she assured me that she was fine to continue the interview until it was over, even if I had to keep her company late into the night. Now, a small part of me felt guilty for keeping this elderly woman up past her bedtime, but there was no changing Katrina's mind. So, I guess, excitedly but still reluctantly, I agreed. Katrina began the final part of her story, telling me the events that followed right after she'd discovered the creature's origin in the Encyclopedia of the Weird, and she recalled that evening saying this.
Daniel and I had just gotten home after we'd returned the Encyclopedia of the Weird back where he'd found it, and we were greeted with terrible news because we found out that our dog, Killer, was missing. The news hurt really bad. I loved Killer. And what was even worse was that he vanished the day before my birthday. I was beginning to believe the words that I'd read in the Encyclopedia of the Weird, but a part of me hoped that I was wrong, and that my birthday tomorrow would be perfect. We'd planned all year to have it at the water park with my friends, but a sudden storm that came out of nowhere ruined those plans. I had no doubt now, because the series of unfortunate events all but confirmed the gruel's unseen power of bad luck, and my brother and I were fed up. So we dug a hole and buried the sponge outside, hoping that it would just rot away into the ground. We then went back into the house to end the day on a good note and with some birthday cake. I thought it was over, but getting rid of the gruel wasn't that easy, because the next morning the flowers and the plants that used to grow in the yard were all dead. I didn't need anyone to tell me that this was the gruel's fault, and I remember being so angry and so upset because I'd pretty much had it with that evil sponge. So I unearthed it from where we'd buried it before, violently hitting it out of just sheer frustration using one of my school books. I really didn't think that it'd get to that point, but as I was earlier, I was at my wit's end and I didn't know what else to do. I wanted to smash it into oblivion so that it would finally leave me alone, but my efforts did nothing to the gruel, as it just bounced back into shape a little while after I'd left it disheveled. That day had gotten really tense, so I wanted to clear my head and just forget about the gruel for a while, but I couldn't even do that, because that's when the evil sponge suddenly went missing. I looked for a few minutes before I finally found out that Daniel had given our friend Carlo the gruel to examine and study, since he didn't get to do it at school because of the foot injury that the gruel caused. My heart dropped to my stomach as I remembered the warning in the Encyclopedia of the Weird and what could potentially happen if I didn't get it back before the day was over. So, Daniel and I immediately went to retrieve it, but when we found Carlo, he'd gotten into a terrible bicycle accident and was now lying on the floor. Carlo told us what happened, telling us that he was taking the gruel home when his bike suddenly swerved off course and crashed. And to make matters worse, the gruel was still missing, as Daniel and I had already looked for it nearby, but it was nowhere to be found. Carlo then said that there were a couple of kids around who might have taken the gruel when he was distracted. And time was running out now, so all three of us rushed to a nearby playground where we found several boys messing around with the gruel. It didn't take long before gruel started affecting the boys, because one of them suddenly got hit with a baseball really hard, and the kid who was holding gruel quickly hurled the evil sponge toward me as he went to check on his friend. We were relieved that we'd finally gotten gruel back, but Daniel and I, we knew that we couldn't live our lives like this. The evil sponge had gotten out of hand, and it was bringing chaos to everything and everyone around it.
Now, just me trying to be helpful, I stop the conversation and I say, hey, well, why don't you just put it into the garbage disposal and then just leave it on? Did you ever try that? And Kat responds with,
Dude, I'm getting there. Hold on. I know I'm 76, but let me tell my story. My plan was to grind gruel into nothing by tossing it into the sink's garbage disposal and leaving it on.
oh, okay.
But the plan turned south quickly as gruel clawed its way out of the drain shortly after. We were running out of options now, and it started to seem like this thing was immortal. But Daniel then decided to get the Encyclopedia of the Weird to see if there was anything that we missed that explained why we couldn't kill gruel. As we flipped through the pages, we eventually came across a section that explained how gruel can't be killed by violent means. Once again, it seemed like all hope was lost, but that's when this bizarre thought popped into my head. It was a long shot, but we'd already tried everything else, so I decided to hold gruel in my arms, and I began to softly sing to it while I caressed the evil sponge. Now again, I know my plan was a stretch, because I assumed that if violence wouldn't work, maybe showing the creature some love and some affection might do something. It took a few seconds, but surprisingly, the evil sponge started to shrink. So I kept singing and petting gruel until it finally laid lifeless in my arms. The evil sponge that terrorized me was finally dead, and it seemed the world around me had suddenly gotten much brighter. Our beloved dog, Killer, miraculously showed up, as if on cue, a little while after gruel's death. The surviving plants and the flowers in our yard were also in much better shape now, all of a sudden. It seemed like they were flourishing again. It was a hard-fought victory, so we went to get some ice cream to celebrate, because Daniel and I both deserved it, for sure. I thought it was finally all over, but my heart skipped a beat when we came back home and saw Killer holding something in its mouth that looked like the larynx. I'd seen it from a distance, but I could have sworn that Killer was clutching just an average-sized potato-like thing that had protruding fangs in its mouth. I'd seen him take it somewhere, but when I checked where Killer had dropped it, that creature was gone. I still wasn't sure if it actually was a larynx, but Daniel and I decided to make sure Killer stopped picking up random mythical creatures in its mouth and bringing these killing machines home. So from that day forward, we always brought Killer a new ball or a nice new chew toy to make sure he didn't pick up any nasty creatures. Our luck was never really the same after gruel, but we'd hoped that we could finally live in peace and eventually start creating these beautiful memories that we wanted to in the first place in our new house.
At this point, Katrina had tears in her eyes as she finished her story. She then told me that she and her family ended up making a lot of happy memories in that home. Daniel had unfortunately passed a few months earlier at 73 years of age, and she said that no matter how old he got, she never stopped seeing him as this oily-faced little brother that she always used to bicker with. Siblings. Katrina told me how quiet and lonely her life was without him. She also said that she missed him very much, and it was at this point that I gave Katrina a hug and promised to visit her from time to time with as many pastries as I could carry. I even joked about introducing her to my own grandma if she ever came to visit me in Dark Falls, and they could knit together sometime or, watch Murder, She Wrote or whatever old people do. I don't know, man. The interview was finally over, and the case was closed. So I bid Katrina goodbye, and I left the Dark Falls Assisted Living Retirement Home. When I got outside, I saw something that made me realize my night was actually far from over. I noticed that I had a flat tire. It had been a while since that had happened, and I was beginning to wonder if the gruel's preserved remains in my back seat were somehow affecting me with its bad luck from beyond the grave. I wasn't convinced at first, because I assumed it was just plain old bad luck. Plus, Katrina mentioned how the gruel's bad luck stops post-mortem. And even though I'd never confirmed if this was true or not, I'd still taken some precautions, like wrapping the preserved remains in a salt-lined cloth before bringing it, because I figured that was the only partially safe containment method that I knew for supernatural entities. There's not a book on this kind of stuff. I told myself that the sudden flat tire was just a crazy coincidence, and that I didn't need to jump to false conclusions or assumptions about the gruel's remains causing my bad luck. However, that was right before I found out that I did not have a spare, and I started to believe that it might be some patented gruel bad luck at work. I began to wonder if the gruel was punishing me for disturbing its resting place after I dug it up yesterday morning from the now abandoned lot where Katrina and Daniel had buried it all of those years ago. There was always a possibility that this could happen, but that was a risk that I was willing to take, because confirming if the gruel actually existed was key to this investigation. On the bright side, if the evil sponge was causing all of this bad luck, it meant that the gruel still retained some of its effects even in death. And with some level of creativity, I could somehow collect the $45 it now owed me to change my tire. It was a crazy idea, and I knew I was delirious for even considering it, but I thought about taking gruel's preserved remains to my bank and just leaving it there so one of the tellers could accidentally wire $1 million into my account and clear my student loans from the system. Right? That's how that works. It seemed great on paper, but I soon realized that there were a lot of loopholes in that plan because it could backfire, and then I could be riddled with even more debt, knowing my luck. Plus, there was also the possibility that this wasn't even the gruel's doing, and the flat tire was entirely my fault. I know this is going to sound odd, but I found it weirdly therapeutic to be able to blame all of my misfortune on some preserved mythical creature's bones. I also knew that I couldn't keep carrying the gruel's potentially dangerous remains around forever. I should be storing them carefully somewhere, for safekeeping. It was very late now, and I didn't think any tow trucks would drive all the way out here to bail me out with a spare tire. So, I just decided to book an Uber to get home before coming back first thing in the morning with a spare tire for my car. I then put gruel's preserved remains in my bag because I just couldn't leave it laying there. And as I got into the Uber driver's car, I hoped I wasn't repeatedly struck by lightning while I made my way home to begin my next case. Speaking of home, I gotta check my dang mailbox, dude. I don't know about you guys, but I go way too long without checking it. But the last time I was out there opening it up, I got this flyer for a new amusement park. I don't know, it looked Like it had bright colors and stuff and whatever. I don't know. I'll check it out. If there's anything in there worth investigating and letting you know about, I guess you'll find out next week. All right. See you then. Hello. I want to say thank you so much for listening to this episode. Hey, you know what the coolest thing in the entire world would be? If you watched another episode right now. I don't know why, I can't explain it, but if you watch 2 of my episodes back to back in one session, it just does crazy things for the algorithm. And if you haven't already, click that subscribe button. You know, it increases the likelihood that whatever platform you're listening to this on will show my stuff to other people who like it just as much as you. You know, who knows? It's probably a good thing, right? And, oh, hey, by the way, if it wasn't obvious in the outro, we're doing Welcome to Horrorland next week. See you then.
Uncovering Dark Falls is written by David Caleb and Dr. Plague. Created, produced, and narrated by Derek Weber.